Welcome. Tonight, you're invited to leave behind the worries of your day and journey back, farther than most ever go, to the final night of an ancient world. This is not a tale of glory and battle or grand conquests carved into stone. No, this is a quieter story, one told in whispers, of silk curtains, fading torches, and the final breath of a queen who defied empires. As the world outside drifted toward darkness, the palace of Alexandria remained lit with oil lamps and memories. While Roman legions marched ever closer, one woman prepared not for war, but for legacy. Her name was Cleopatra. She ruled not only with intelligence and elegance, but with an unbreakable will. And now, on this last night, she stood at the edge of history, wrapped in gold and silence. Tonight, as the rain patters gently outside your window and your breathing begins to slow, let this story unfold around you like a linen veil in the desert breeze. It is a story of beauty and sorrow, of empire and ending, of choices made in moonlight. So close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift softly into the last night of Egypt's last queen. The story is about to begin. The day was drawing its last breath. Above the great city of Alexandria, the sky began its quiet descent into night. What was once a canvas of blazing gold had softened into muted hues of peach and lavender. As the sun slipped behind the horizon, the clouds caught fire, their edges tinged with a fleeting blush of pink, like faded silk brushed by candlelight. Far below, the city murmured in response. Its wide boulevards and narrow alleyways gradually emptied of voices and feet, as if the stones themselves sighed with relief from the heat of the day. Merchants closed the shutters of their market stalls, each creak and clang a part of the evening ritual. Mothers called children home, their words echoing gently across courtyards where citrus trees swayed and released their bittersweet perfume into the cooling air. Down by the harbor, the sea had turned to glass. Fishermen, silhouetted against the last light, hauled in their nets slowly, arms moving with the rhythm of generations. The salt spray clung to their skin, mingling with the scent of brine and sweat and wet rope. Nearby, a boy tied a boat to a dock post, his bare feet slapping the planks with soft, hollow thuds. He paused a moment, staring out at the vastness of the water. The sea, at this hour, seemed to stretch into forever, and towering over it all, like a patient guardian of time itself, stood the great Pharos of Alexandria. Its flame, lit at dusk by unseen hands, began to glow with purpose. Slowly, it pulsed through the gathering mist, casting its golden eye far across the darkening waves. It had been there for centuries, that light, welcoming ships, warning enemies, and watching silently as empires rose and fell. Closer to the city's heart, the Library of Alexandria stood in solemn grace. Massive doors had already been sealed shut for the night. The scrolls within, hundreds of thousands of them, lay in wait, wrapped in silence, holding centuries of thought and truth and wonder. A few pigeons cooed in the shadows of the library's stone colonnades. Their wings caught glints of the fading light, flickering like distant memories. The streets beyond glowed with the first lanterns of evening. Light spilled softly from open windows, golden pools falling across mosaic floors. Servants moved quietly from house to house, lighting oil lamps with long reeds dipped in fire. Their faces, young and old, flickered with amber shadows. They whispered greetings to one another, not out of fear, but reverence for the hush of dusk. In the palace gardens, olive trees whispered secrets. Leaves fluttered in the breeze, silvery and soft. The night air carried with it a delicate blend of perfumes. Crushed basil, wild mint, warm cedar from distant fires. Somewhere behind the high courtyard walls, water trickled in a marble fountain, its rhythm slow, almost sleepy. A white peacock moved along the edge of the path, feathers trailing like royal fabric behind it, silent and unhurried. And within the palace walls, the queen did not sleep. She stood by the tall, open windows of her chamber, wrapped in robes of sheer linen. Her dark hair, perfumed with rose oil, hung loose about her shoulders, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, watched the Nile in silence, as she had done 1,000 times before. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air held weight. The stars, though just beginning to appear, already seemed to mourn. Her fingertips grazed the windowsill, worn smooth by years of watching. Below, the city stretched out like a story half told, full of temples and towers, of markets and mysteries. She knew every corner of it, every scent and shadow. Alexandria had been her throne and her prison, her dream and her inheritance. Behind her, attendants moved quietly, laying out robes, braiding cords of gold, preparing incense. But she did not turn. She barely breathed. Even the soft footfalls of her most trusted servant went unnoticed. From far beyond the palace gates, drums began to sound, distant, deliberate. Roman soldiers, perhaps, or priests welcoming the stars, or simply the heartbeat of a city that did not yet know it was dying. Cleopatra closed her eyes. She did not weep, not yet. Instead, she listened, to the birds settling in the fig trees, to the clink of lanterns swaying on metal hooks, to the hush of waves against stone. The night was here, and it had come at last for her. In the stillness of her private chamber, Cleopatra stood motionless. The marble beneath her bare feet was cool, smooth, veined with silver that shimmered softly beneath the flicker of nearby oil lamps. Outside, the warm breeze of the Egyptian night flowed through tall windows draped with linen, their long curtains breathing gently inward and outward like the lungs of the palace itself. She faced the window, eyes distant, hands resting lightly on the carved windowsill. Hands that had signed treaties, held children, touched emperors, and now trembled ever so slightly. She wore no crown, no emeralds, no gold. Only a robe of fine linen clung to her figure, the fabric whispering against her skin with each slow movement. Her dark hair, once arranged with gems and pins, now fell loose down her back, the scent of rose oil lingering faintly in the air. She had dismissed her attendants an hour ago with a single soft gesture. There was no need for words. They had served her too long not to understand. The room was silent, and yet alive. Firelight danced in polished bronze bowls, casting trembling shadows upon the stone walls. A bowl of figs sat untouched on a nearby table. Incense smoldered low in the corner, frankincense and cedarwood, sweet, earthy, and ancient. Cleopatra closed her eyes and inhaled. The scent reminded her of temples and prayers, of the time before all this, before war, before Rome, before destiny weighed like iron upon her shoulders. Through the open window, the sounds of Alexandria reached her. Distant hoofbeats, the faint clatter of armor, a dog barking once and falling silent. Somewhere, a child was crying, then hushed by a mother's voice. Cleopatra did not flinch. The city was folding inward, preparing for whatever came next. She knew what came next. She had always known. Rome had not come to parley. It had come to erase. She remembered Caesar's voice in the garden. She remembered Antony's laughter echoing through the columns. She remembered the moment each one left her, one by fate, the other by blade. Now it was her turn to leave. Not by surrender, not by chains, but on her own terms. As pharaoh, as goddess, as mother of a kingdom that would not rise again. She turned from the window and walked slowly across the chamber. Her footsteps barely whispered over the floor. She passed by scrolls and gifts, mirrors and tapestries, none of which called her name tonight. At a small writing table, she sat and took up a reed pen. The parchment before her remained blank for several minutes. Then slowly, with deliberate grace, she began to write. Not a command, not a decree, but a farewell. To her children, to Egypt, to the stars, the palace, once filled with the murmurs of diplomacy and celebration, now spoke only in echoes. Its long marble corridors, polished by centuries of sandal and bare foot, stretched into silence. Torches burned low in their sconces, their flames swaying slightly with each shift of the night breeze that slipped through unseen cracks. Somewhere deep within the stonework, a door creaked quietly, then settled again. Servants had withdrawn to the edges of the structure, their duties completed, their movements hushed. Only a few remained within the heart of the palace, gliding along the walls like phantoms of an era already passing. Linen robes brushed against columns. Bronze trays were set down with delicate care, never breaking the hush. They did not speak to one another. They did not need to. The weight of what was coming had settled across them like desert sand. Soft, heavy, inescapable. The halls had memories. Beneath their vaulted ceilings, Cleopatra had once walked in procession, crowned and draped in silk, her voice carrying authority, her gaze unflinching. Now the same halls felt too wide, too empty. The mosaic floors, once gleaming with color, now seemed muted under the dim light, like a memory of joy, fading. A cat, pale and long-limbed, padded silently through the shadows, pausing by a statue of Isis to wash its paw. Its eyes caught the flame of a lamp and glowed for an instant like twin suns before it disappeared again into the dark. Along one corridor, behind a screen of gauze curtains, a servant girl knelt in silent prayer, her fingers counting beads worn smooth by devotion. She did not pray for victory. She prayed for peace, for dignity, for whatever gentle end might await her queen. The sound of Cleopatra's footsteps when they came were soft but unmistakable, measured, solemn. She moved through the palace like someone saying goodbye to an old friend. Her fingers grazed familiar surfaces, a tapestry from Kush, a lion-headed brazier from Memphis, the carved bust of a long-dead ancestor. Everything was where it had always been, and yet nothing felt as it once had. Even the air had changed. It was cooler now, still, like the calm before a temple ritual, or a burial. In the farthest hallway, near the eastern garden, a single door stood closed, heavy, final. Beyond it waited the chamber where the queen would face her end, not with tears, not with fear, but with silence, with poise, with memory in her bones and fire in her heart. And until that door opened, the palace whispered on. Marble held its breath, and Egypt, for just a moment longer, dreamed. In the private quarters beyond the ceremonial halls, a gentle haze hung in the air, soft and fragrant, like breath suspended in time. It rose from shallow bronze bowls placed carefully around the room, each one filled with glowing embers and powdered resin. Thin ribbons of smoke curled upward, dancing lazily toward the ceiling. Their scent was rich, ancient, and unmistakable. Myrrh, frankincense, crushed rose petals, and a touch of cinnamon bark. This was the aroma of ritual, of farewell, of preparation not for a journey of the body, but of the soul. Cleopatra stood in the center of the chamber, eyes half closed, breathing it in, slowly, deeply. The scent wrapped around her like a veil, stirring memories from places long buried. She remembered her mother's perfume, always the same mixture, worn on feast days and nights of devotion. She remembered walking past temple altars as a child, when priests burned myrrh to call the gods down from their hidden places in the sky. She remembered incense smoke rising in coils above Antony's bed, long after his voice had grown quiet. Her maidens, silent and graceful, moved around her in choreographed precision. They worked without speaking, without even glancing at one another, each one fully aware of what to do and why it mattered. One unfastened the queen's robe with care, folding it as if it were a sacred scroll. Another dipped a small ivory spoon into a basin of fragrant oil and gently applied it to Cleopatra's shoulders, her arms, her back. The oil shimmered in the light like melted gold. The scent grew stronger. Outside, the sounds of the city had softened to almost nothing. The people of Alexandria had gone to sleep, or pretended to. Doors were bolted, lamps were snuffed. Those who feared Rome dreamed restlessly. Those who didn't were fewer by the day. Inside the queen's chamber, time felt still. Each movement, each breath, felt slow and deliberate, as though Cleopatra were shedding not just her robe, but every layer of pain, power, memory, and expectation that had ever been placed upon her. She had carried Egypt for years, on her shoulders, in her womb, in her heart. And now, in these final hours, she returned to the most human of rituals, the act of touch, of scent, of closing the circle, a final brushing of her hair, a drop of sandalwood along her neck, a dusting of lotus powder across her shoulders. These were the small, sacred things that had always marked great transitions: birth, marriage, coronation, death. And through it all, the scent of myrrh lingered, deep, warming, holy, the very smell of endings, and the promise that something somewhere might begin again. The chamber was quiet now, lit only by the soft glow of a single oil lamp whose flame curved gently each time Cleopatra exhaled. The scent of myrrh still lingered, but now it had faded into the background, replaced by the faint smell of parchment, wax, and ink. The queen sat alone at her writing table, its surface carved from smooth ebony wood, worn at the edges by years of use and memory. Before her lay a small stack of papyrus sheets, fresh, clean, and empty. She dipped the reed pen slowly into a pot of ink the color of aged blood. Her fingers moved with deliberate calm, no hesitation, no tremble. For all the uncertainty that surrounded her, this moment felt sharp and clear. Cleopatra had spoken to generals, to gods, to emperors, but now she would write to ghosts, to shadows, to those who would never write back. The first letter was for her eldest son. She began not with politics or titles, but with a memory of a sunlit garden, the scent of orange blossoms, and the sound of his laughter chasing doves through the grass. She told him to be brave, to remember where he came from, and that strength does not always come with a sword. That being Egyptian meant carrying the weight of sand and sky, and never forgetting the names of your ancestors. The second letter, thinner, more fragile, was for Antony. She paused before she wrote it, her eyes fixed on the edge of the page as if waiting for something to arrive before she began. When the words finally came, they were not bitter. They were not even mournful. They were warm and private and soft around the edges like sea-smoothed stone. She did not ask why he left her. She simply told him she would follow soon, and that she had already forgiven everything. A third letter, addressed to no one, began with only a name: Egypt. This one she wrote slowly, carefully. It was not a letter in the usual sense, but a quiet declaration of love, a record of devotion, a final embrace. She wrote of the Nile and its silver mornings, of the mountains in the south and the stars that glimmered above the temples in Thebes. She wrote of papyrus swaying in the breeze and the long songs sung by boatmen as they ferried life from one shore to the other. She wrote of a people who endured and who always would. By the time the final line had been drawn, the ink had dried across her knuckles. She placed each letter gently into a folded cloth pouch, tied it closed with a golden thread, and sealed it with wax bearing her royal mark, a coiled serpent poised to strike. Then she placed the pouch beside her bed, knowing that even if no one read them, the words had still been spoken. That was enough. Sometimes the act of saying goodbye is not for the listener, but for the speaker. And with that, she sat quietly, the silence surrounding her like a second skin. No tears fell. No final plea escaped her lips, only the sound of a quill being set down, and the slow, steady breath of a queen who had made peace with her end. The night deepened, folding the palace in layers of stillness. Beyond the chamber walls, the city murmured in sleep, unaware that its last monarch sat alone with the ghosts of her past. Cleopatra had risen from the writing table. The letters were finished, the ink dried. But memory lingered, vivid and stubborn, like the perfume on her skin or the echoes in her mind. She moved toward a small alcove at the far end of the room, one that had remained unchanged for many years. Here, behind a thin veil of woven reeds, stood a statue of Julius Caesar. Carved in white stone, eyes fixed ahead, expression calm, powerful, almost godlike. It was not a large sculpture, nor the most ornate, but it was precise. She had commissioned it herself. She had overseen every curve of the cheek, every angle of the jaw. Now, in the quiet of this final night, she stood before it once more. How young she had been when he arrived in Egypt. Roman, brilliant, terrifying in his confidence. He had not come to love, and yet somehow he had. And she, still barely more than a girl cloaked in titles, had discovered in him both a partner and a mirror. Not of gentleness, but of ambition, of will, of empire. Their time together had been brief, but it had reshaped the world. Not just through their son, born of empires entwined, but through every alliance, every war, every sleepless night spent sketching futures in the air. She had watched him step into legend. And then she had watched Rome take him down with knives in the Forum. She did not cry then, she did not cry now, but she spoke softly to the statue, as she always did when no one could hear. Her voice barely disturbed the air. He thought he could build something new, she whispered. But you were not ready, were you? None of you were. Her fingertips brushed the cool marble, and in the dark, it almost felt like skin. She closed her eyes and remembered his laugh. Not warm, not tender, but dry and amused. Like someone who had already won a game no one else knew they were playing. He had taught her how to wield the world, and now she would leave it. Not in chains, not in disgrace, but in the same silence he had left. Surrounded by power, wrapped in mystery. As she turned away, the flickering lamp caught the shadow of the statue on the wall. For just a moment, it seemed to move. Elongated, distorted, watching her go. She did not look back. The ghost of Caesar had already followed her too far. In the distance, beyond the marble walls and gauze-veiled balconies of Cleopatra's inner sanctum, the storm that had been gathering for years was no longer a threat. It had arrived. Not as wind or fire, but in the form of armored feet, polished shields, and red banners that bled through Alexandria's sun-faded streets. The sound was steady, deliberate, and wholly Roman. It began as a dull pulse, like a second heartbeat beneath the city's skin, and grew, step by step, wheel by wheel, into something heavier, inescapable. Rome had not come as a diplomat this time. It came clothed in conquest. With each turn of the hourglass, the legions moved closer to the palace gates, winding through the lower districts like water finding the lowest stone. Soldiers stood at corners where poets once recited verse. Standard bearers passed by shrines where incense still lingered. Alexandria, the great city of learning and light, was being folded into silence under the weight of Roman discipline. From her eastern window, Cleopatra watched the horizon without blinking. The sky had turned a darker shade of violet, stretched thin over the desert edge. She could not see them, not from this distance, but she could feel them. She had learned long ago to sense armies as other women sense the weather. The shift in the wind, the sudden silence of birds, the smell of metal where there should be only sand. She pressed her palm to the cool stone wall, grounding herself. The view was familiar. Rooftops of alabaster and sandstone, trees swaying gently beside ancient colonnades. But it no longer felt like hers. Rome had not yet entered the palace, and yet its shadow already filled the halls. It lived in every hurried whisper between servants, in the way guards shifted their weight too often, in the unnatural stillness of the pigeons that used to flock above the courtyard tiles. Cleopatra had faced Rome before. She had shared wine with Caesar, lain beside Antony. She had spoken their language, worn their silks, studied their maps. But this Rome, the Rome of Octavian, was different. It was colder, sharper, more methodical. Octavian did not come to admire Egypt. He came to dismantle it. He had inherited the ambition of Caesar, but none of his heat. This was not personal to him. It was mechanical. It was empire tightening its grip. She turned from the window and crossed the room in silence, trailing her fingers along the frame of a bronze mirror. Her reflection was lit only by a single lamp, her face still regal, still composed, though her eyes betrayed the knowledge that this moment had long been coming. Not just for her, but for Egypt. For the last thread of independence in a world that was being painted over with Roman red. In the halls below, she could hear the palace guards shifting posts more often than usual. Boots on stone, the clink of spears, a cough silenced too quickly. Everyone was pretending it was just another night, but the lie was too thin to hold. Even the cats that roamed the inner corridors moved more carefully now, avoiding corners as if they too knew what lingered just outside the gates. And yet, in the center of it all, Cleopatra remained still. She did not summon her generals. She did not light a signal fire. She made no speech to her remaining court. Instead, she let the weight of the storm settle over her, accepted its presence like one accepts the tide. Resistance now would not be noble. It would be noise. And Cleopatra, above all else, understood the power of silence when it was chosen rather than forced. As the wind brushed through the open shutters and rustled the hanging drapes behind her, she exhaled slowly, allowing the moment to pass through her like breath. She had given everything, her mind, her body, her blood, to hold back this future. And now that it had arrived, she met it not with panic, but with something far older than fear. She met it with dignity. In the garden, the lotus flowers remained closed for the night, floating gently on the still water of the reflecting pool. And above them, the stars, steady, silent, uncaring, watched a queen prepare to leave the world, even as an empire prepared to enter it. The chamber where Cleopatra's children slept was tucked deep within the palace, behind heavy curtains and walls lined with murals of falcons, lotuses, and sacred suns. It had been decorated not with the cold pomp of royalty, but with a mother's care. Low cushions scattered across the floor, tiny sandals set neatly by the doorway, and a faint aroma of lavender lingering from the oil lamps that flickered gently in the corners of the room. This place, more than any other in the palace, had once echoed with laughter, of running feet, bedtime songs, and the innocent questions only children dared to ask queens. Now it was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles just before farewell. Cleopatra stepped into the room with bare feet and slow breath, her robe trailing behind her like a breeze. Her gaze moved first to the youngest, her daughter, lying curled beneath a fine linen sheet, arms wrapped around a soft stuffed ibis doll. Beside her, her son, older now, eyes closed but not yet asleep, clutched a worn scroll he had insisted on reading every night, a story of Horus and his golden wings. She knelt beside him, her hands brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead, and for a long moment she simply watched him, studying every detail. His cheeks, the slope of his nose, the faint crease between his brows when he dreamed. He opened his eyes. "Mama," he whispered, not sitting up but reaching for her hand. She held it gently, folding her fingers around his. "I'm here," she said, her voice like the hush of silk over stone. "Is it true?" he asked. "Are the Romans coming?" Cleopatra did not lie, not to him. "Yes," she said softly. "They are close." He didn't cry. He only nodded, the way children do when they understand more than they're meant to, and less than they wish they did. "Will they hurt us?" She paused, then leaned in, pressing a kiss to his temple. "You are a prince of Egypt," she said. "You are brave, and no matter where you go or what happens, you will carry this land inside you. The Nile runs in your blood. He looked at her for a moment longer, then turned his face into the pillow, eyes finally closing. She sat beside him until his breathing deepened into sleep, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of his hand. When she rose, she crossed quietly to her daughter. The little one had not stirred. Her dreams were still untouched by fear, filled instead with lullabies and sun-drenched gardens. Cleopatra brushed the girl's cheek, tucked the blanket higher around her shoulders, and placed a small gold amulet beneath the pillow. A charm of Hathor for protection, though she knew its power was more comfort than shield. And then, standing between them, Cleopatra felt the weight of her choice. She had ruled nations. She had held her own against Rome. But this moment, this quiet act of leaving, was the heaviest burden of all. To walk away without waking them. To love them enough to let them sleep. She wanted to whisper everything. Who she was, what she had done, how fiercely she had fought for their future. But there was no time, and no words big enough to hold all of that. Instead, she gave them silence. She gave them peace. And she gave them memory of a mother who came in the night to say goodbye, not with sorrow, but with all the grace a queen could offer her children. As she stepped out of the room, she did not look back, because if she had, she knew she would never leave. She found herself drawn to the west wing of the palace, a place she had not entered in many weeks, perhaps longer. The halls here were darker, quieter, lined with tall shadowed pillars and hanging curtains untouched by the breeze. The air was heavy, not unpleasant, but still, as though time itself had chosen to rest there. It was in this part of the palace that Mark Antony had once lived, moved, laughed, and grieved. And now it was here that his presence lingered, not in voice or figure, but in the ache of remembered closeness. Cleopatra walked slowly, her fingers grazing the walls as she passed, each touch awakening memories stored in stone. There had been music in these halls once, lutes and flutes, the low drumbeat of celebration after victories that now felt like myths. She remembered the scent of wine on his breath, the way he spoke in fragments when excited, his need for passion in all things. He had arrived like a storm, brash, broken, brilliant, and for a time, they had ruled the world together, two stars burning too close to survive for long. When she reached his chamber, she paused at the threshold. The door stood open. Inside, the room remained exactly as it had been the last time he left it. Armor draped over a marble bench, a goblet on the floor. The maps they had studied still unrolled on the table, faded now but not forgotten. Even the sandal he had discarded in haste one night remained by the hearth. No one had dared touch it, not out of reverence, not even fear, but something more enduring. Love that refused to be disturbed. She stepped inside. Her breath was slow, deliberate. The echo of her footfall was the only sound. And yet, the silence was not empty. It was full of him. It was filled with his laughter, his rage, his sorrow. She could feel it pressing against the air like the scent of thunder before a storm. She moved to the couch where he had often sat, and for a long while she did not sit, only stood beside it, staring at the worn leather where his hands once rested. Then, gently, she lowered herself, folding her hands in her lap, as if waiting for a conversation to resume. And in a way, it did. She spoke to him, quietly at first, as though uncertain whether the words would find their way through the veil that separates the living from the dead. She told him what had happened since he fell on his sword, what Rome had done, how the people had changed, how his name still held weight but now only in whispers. She told him how she had kept going, how she had not broken, even when the marble cracked around her. And then, her voice lowered, and she told him the truth, that she had missed him, not just as a ruler or a protector, but as a man, that she had woken in the night reaching for a hand that would never be there again, that their love had been flawed, fierce, desperate, and that it had been real. She leaned back, her eyes drifting toward the ceiling, where shadows played like ghosts across the beams. In that moment, she did not feel like a queen. She felt like a woman sitting in the ruins of a shared dream, one that had once stretched across continents and now fit inside a single hollow room. A breeze moved through the window then. Small, cool, unexpected. It stirred the edge of a curtain, caused the flame of a nearby lamp to flicker. And just for a heartbeat, she felt something else too. Not a presence, not a voice, but a warmth, as if the past had reached forward to sit beside her one last time. She did not cry. Her tears had already been spent long ago. But when she stood and turned to leave, her steps were slower, softer. She walked not as a ruler preparing to die, but as a woman who had already mourned. And now, at last, had said goodbye. The night had grown thick and still. Even the faint noises of the city, distant voices, hooves on cobblestone, the moan of wind against sandstone, had receded, as if all Alexandria had paused to hold its breath. Within the palace, all movement slowed. Curtains hung motionless. Lamps burned low and steady. The air itself seemed to press inward, as if the world knew what was coming and refused to disturb it. Cleopatra walked slowly through the narrow corridor that led to the treasury vault. It was not wealth she sought. It was ritual. She passed rows of chests filled with emeralds, stacks of cloth dyed in rare Tyrian purple, gold coins stamped with her profile. None of it touched. That kind of legacy no longer mattered. History, she knew, would remember her not for what she ruled, but for how she chose to leave it. At the far end of the chamber, a small alcove was carved into the wall. Simple, unadorned. Within it, encased in a wooden box lined with palm leaves and soft cloth, was the creature she had ordered to be prepared days ago, though she had not yet looked upon it until now. The asp, sacred symbol of royalty, of divine death, of transformation. Not a monster, not a killer, but a messenger, a guardian. It slept, or perhaps waited, coiled in silence as if aware of its role in the drama unfolding around it. Its scales shimmered faintly in the lamplight, each movement small and deliberate. Cleopatra watched it for a long time before kneeling slowly beside the box, her breath even, her hands steady. She did not fear the creature. It was not her enemy. It was the instrument of her choice, a final act of control in a world that had taken so much from her. Rome would not drag her through its streets. She would not be paraded before crowds, stripped of dignity, of sovereignty, of myth. Her story would not end in chains, but in silence and gold. She reached for a folded strip of linen and placed it gently beside the asp's enclosure. On it were painted hieroglyphs, prayers to Isis, to guide the soul, to shield it from unrest, to carry it safely across the river between worlds. She whispered the words aloud, not for those nearby, but for the gods who still listened, the ones who had walked with her ancestors through deserts, across thrones, into stars. Her hand hovered above the box for a moment longer, and then she stood, turned, and walked back through the corridor, not quickly, not slowly, but with the grace of one who had made peace with every step. The asp would come to her later. It would be placed with care, and when the time arrived, it would fulfill its role not as punishment, but as passage. Cleopatra did not see death as an end. Not truly. In her world, in her lineage, death was another kind of coronation. One not held in halls of men, but in the sacred silence of the gods. And in that silence, the queen had already begun to rise. The chamber was warm, heavy with the scent of crushed rose petals and steam. Lanterns glowed from niches in the walls, their light softened by fine alabaster screens. The flickering glow played gently across the tiled floor, where shallow pools of water shimmered with golden light. In the center, a bath carved from pale limestone rested like a sanctuary, its edges smooth from years of royal use, its surface now still and waiting. This was no ordinary bath, and this was no ordinary hour. Cleopatra stood quietly at the edge of the water. Her linen robe slid from her shoulders without resistance, falling to the floor like a whisper. Her skin caught the light of the oil lamps, smooth and pale beneath the veil of fragrant steam. The air smelled of honey and frankincense, of orange blossoms and milk warmed slowly over coals. It was a scent she had always loved, not for its sweetness, but for its memory. Her mother had used the same oils, and her grandmother before her. As she stepped into the bath, the water wrapped around her like silk, warm, enveloping, alive. The petals floated around her body, brushing her skin as if offering their own quiet farewell. Her breath slowed, her eyelids lowered. The sounds of the palace, the faint rustle of servants, the distant creak of old wood, the occasional hum of night birds, drifted away behind her, leaving only the soft lapping of water against stone. She bathed without haste. This was not a ritual of vanity, nor mourning. It was preparation, an act of intention. One final cleansing before the veil. As her handmaids poured pitchers of milk over her shoulders, the liquid cascaded in pale ribbons, swirling through the petals and catching the light like falling stars. They worked in silence, their movements respectful, graceful, reverent. They had done this many times for many queens, but never like this. Never knowing it was the last. Her skin was massaged with oil, fig and almond mixed with crushed myrrh, until it glowed faintly in the candlelight. Her hair was combed through slowly, then braided in a single loose coil down her back. A garland of fresh lotus blossoms was placed at her feet, floating there as if drawn by gravity and grace. And all the while, Cleopatra said nothing. She closed her eyes and let memory wash over her like water. She thought of the Nile in spring, fat and golden beneath the sun, of temple ceilings painted with stars, of lovers who had stood behind her in the dark. She thought of her children sleeping only a few corridors away, of their small hands, their unformed dreams. And she thought of Egypt, not the borders or the soldiers or the crown, but the feeling of it, the soul of it, the weight of centuries that had flowed through her veins since the day she was born. By the time she rose from the bath, the water was still warm, but she no longer felt it. The handmaids wrapped her in soft linen towels, their faces unreadable, their eyes lowered. She allowed herself to be dried, anointed, and dressed without a word. There was nothing more to say. The last bath was not meant for cleansing. It was meant for remembering. The room where Cleopatra was dressed for her final appearance was quiet, almost reverent in its stillness. There was no rush, no commands, only the soft rustling of fabric, the clink of polished gold, and the deep hush that filled the space like prayer. The chamber was lit by a ring of tall bronze lamps, their flames steady, casting warm halos of light across the walls where the stories of past queens were carved. Each one wrapped in splendor, each one frozen in time. She stood at the center, a column of stillness amidst motion. Her hair, still damp from the bath, had been dried with linen and lightly perfumed with crushed jasmine. It was now being woven into a loose crown braid, the style worn by the divine mothers of Egypt, Isis, Hathor, Nephthys. A circlet of gold, shaped like a cobra coiled to strike, waited silently nearby. Her robe was unlike any she had worn before. It had been hidden away for years, saved for coronations or tombs, for the rarest and most sacred transitions. Woven from silk brought over land and sea, dyed the deep violet of twilight. It shimmered with threads of gold sewn by hand, one, by artisans who would never know what it was truly meant for. It clung to her body like moonlight draped over shadow, fluid and flawless. When she moved, it made no sound, only a soft sigh, like the breath of the gods. Around her waist, a wide belt was fastened, lapis, onyx, and carnelian set into hammered gold. Its weight was familiar. So many times she had worn such symbols of power. But tonight, it was not about power. It was about identity, legacy, pride. Her arms were adorned with cuffs shaped like lotus stems and twin Uraeus serpents. Each toe was dusted with crushed pearl and sandalwood. At her throat, a necklace Cleopatra had worn as a child was placed once more. A delicate string of blue faience beads, simple compared to the grandeur that surrounded her, but worn with meaning no crown could match. She looked into the bronze mirror before her and did not see a woman broken by empire. She did not see a widow or a prisoner. She saw a queen, a priestess, the final thread of a lineage that stretched back through time, back through dynasties, back to gods. The handmaidens stood back, their work complete. No one spoke. There were no instructions, no questions, only a hush that acknowledged what had been done. Cleopatra turned slowly, testing the robe's movement, feeling the fabric swirl around her legs, its hem brushing the floor like mist. The gold of her cuffs glinted in the lamplight. Her shadow stretched tall and straight against the wall, wearing the same crown she now bore. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, as if by instinct, the servants bowed, not out of ritual, but in reverence. Not because she had demanded it, but because they knew, deep in the oldest part of themselves, that they were witnessing the final image of Egypt as it had always been. She would not die in chains. She would not go quietly. She would go as she had lived, draped in silk and gold, with her spine unbent and her eyes unafraid. And when she stepped from that room, into the chamber where the end awaited, the world behind her held its silence. Because beauty may fade and kingdoms may fall, but dignity leaves its mark forever. The chamber reserved for devotion was small, circular, and open to the night sky. Its ceiling had long ago been removed to allow the stars a place to look down. Pillars lined the perimeter, carved with symbols older than language, each one etched with the names of gods and queens, prayers and power. The floor was black stone, polished smooth, cool beneath Cleopatra's bare feet as she stepped into the sacred circle alone. She had come here many times, not as a ruler making offerings for favor, but as a daughter of Egypt seeking peace. Sometimes, in years past, she had brought her children. Sometimes, she had come after loss. But tonight, she came with full awareness. This would be her last prayer. The altar at the center of the room was simple. A raised platform of limestone, veined with mineral patterns that looked like the flowing of the Nile. Upon it, a small figure of Isis sat. Wings outstretched, her face serene, her body cloaked in ancient dignity. Around the statue lay a circle of offerings. Lotus flowers, bowls of dates and honey, oil lamps whose flames wavered gently in the breeze, as if stirred by invisible breath. Cleopatra knelt before the goddess without hesitation. There were no guards, no servants, no scribes. Only her, the moonlight, and the echo of prayers spoken through generations. She rested her hands on her thighs, inhaled slowly, and closed her eyes. She did not ask for rescue. She did not plead for miracles. She spoke instead in a whisper that was nearly a breath, reverent and low, spoken in the tongue of her foremothers. Isis, great mother, keeper of life and death, I do not come to beg. I come to return. Her words floated up into the open sky like threads of incense smoke, rising into the arms of the goddess above. You have walked with me through deserts and through halls. You stood behind me when I gave birth, when I took the throne, when I buried my kin. And now I ask only this, that I may pass into your care with grace, that my children will be watched, that Egypt will not forget its voice. A gust of wind brushed through the circle then, gentle but firm, causing the flames in the lamps to flutter in unison. The petals scattered slightly on the altar. Cleopatra opened her eyes. She did not take it as a sign. not in the way of omens or prophecy. It was simply the night answering. And in that response, she felt calm. She reached forward and placed a final offering upon the altar. A ring taken from her own hand, the gold warm from her skin. Upon its surface was the carving of a falcon in flight, wings wide, eyes forward. It was a piece she had worn since she was a girl, given to her on the day her father told her what it meant to rule. She left it there without regret. Then she bowed low, her forehead touching the stone, her breath deep and steady. It was not submission. It was completion. When she rose again, she stood taller than before. Her face bore the quiet strength of one who had surrendered nothing, not even in the final hour. She turned from the altar, her footsteps slow and sure as she walked back into the dark corridor beyond the shrine. The stars watched her go, silent and unblinking, and the goddess said nothing. She didn't need to. The garden had always been her sanctuary. Even as a girl, Cleopatra had wandered these paths beneath fig trees and palms, brushing her fingers across the silver-green leaves, pausing to listen to the wind speak through the reeds. Tonight, it was no different. And yet, everything had changed. The world outside the palace walls teetered on the edge of conquest. But here, in this walled oasis, the night remained still. She stepped barefoot onto the smooth stone path, her silken robe trailing quietly behind her. Moonlight poured down in long beams, dappling the walkway through the arched pergolas and casting shadows from the flowering vines that curled along the columns. The air was cool and soft against her skin, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine, damp earth, and fading citrus. The trees whispered gently in the breeze. Leaves rustled, not in warning, but like a soft voice trying to comfort a tired child. Somewhere nearby, water trickled from a marble fountain into a shallow pool, its rhythm patient and timeless. Small white flowers floated on its surface, spinning slowly in circles with no destination. Cleopatra walked slowly. There was no urgency in her step, only thought. Each footfall was a meditation, each breath a quiet reckoning. Her mind wandered not through empires or battles, but through the moments in between. The laughter of her children beneath the olive trees, the scent of papyrus warmed by the sun, the way Antony used to place his hand at the small of her back when no one else was watching. She paused beneath an acacia tree, its branches stretched wide above her like a canopy. The shadows it cast were long and elegant, crisscrossing the path like woven silk. She tilted her head back and looked through the leaves to the stars above. Bright, unmoving, eternal. Once, long ago, a priest had told her that the stars were the souls of queens, returned to watch over the land they once ruled. She didn't believe it, not in the way she had believed in strategy or language or bloodlines, but still she had always found comfort in looking up. Tonight, they looked back with a quiet familiarity, not as judges, not as gods, but as companions. She continued her walk, past carved stone benches, over mosaic tiles that told stories of gods and lovers and kings now forgotten. She moved past the herb garden, where basil and mint grew wild, their scent clinging to the night air like a memory of warmth. A cat darted across the path ahead of her, pale, long-limbed, its eyes catching the moonlight for an instant before vanishing into the vines. In the center of the garden, she paused. A single lotus grew from the pond, its petals wide open, luminous in the dark. Cleopatra stepped closer, knelt beside it, and reached out, not to pluck it, but to feel the air that surrounded it. It reminded her of herself, rooted in still water, surrounded by beauty, opening even in darkness. She stayed there for a long time, simply breathing. There was no speech to be made, no audience, no crown to hold. And yet, in that garden, under that sky, she had never felt more fully seen. When she finally rose, she did so with calm. The path behind her held her footprints. The air remembered her presence. The garden did not ask her to stay. It simply witnessed her, and that was enough. The palace terrace that overlooked the Nile had always offered the most breathtaking view in Alexandria. Cleopatra stepped into its quiet expanse, just as the last clouds of dusk dissolved into true night. Before her, the great river stretched into darkness, silver-threaded beneath the glow of the moon. The water moved without urgency, slow and smooth, like a mirror to the stars above. It was a living thing, older than cities, older than kingdoms, older than memory itself. She walked to the railing, her hand brushing the cool stone ledge, and looked out across the current. There were no boats this late, no music, no flames, just the hush of the wind as it passed over the water and curled around her like a veil. Above her, the sky had blossomed with stars, thousands of them, scattered like seeds across the heavens. She knew their names, not the names given by Rome or Greece, but the ancient ones, spoken in temples when the world was young. Sopdet, the dog star, glowed in the east, marking time as it had for millennia. The constellation of the lion curled above the horizon. To her, the stars were not cold or distant. They were constant. They were witnesses. For a moment, Cleopatra felt herself lifted, not in body, but in thought. Her life, so tangled in earthbound things, love, war, children, crowns, seemed suddenly small beneath that vast tapestry. And yet, in that smallness, there was peace, humility, freedom. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the stone, letting her gaze follow the slow curve of the Nile as it disappeared into darkness. Somewhere far upstream, the river passed fields of grain, silent villages, temples lost to time. It fed life. It carried stories. And in its reflection tonight, it carried her. She thought of her ancestors, kings and queens who had ruled from Thebes and Memphis, who had walked these same stones, seen these same stars. She thought of her children, asleep within the walls behind her, and wondered what stars they would chase, what stories they might still write. Perhaps they would never wear crowns. Perhaps they would live in exile, remembered only in footnotes and faded coins. And yet, they were hers. They were Egypt, carried forward. A soft breeze passed over her, cool and clean, lifting a strand of her hair as gently as a mother might brush a child's face. She closed her eyes and listened to the water, to the silence, to the night itself. In the end, it wasn't the sound of armies or the roar of crowds that defined a reign. It was this stillness, this moment of being fully present in a world that was vanishing beneath her feet. When she opened her eyes again, the stars remained, bright, unchanged, watching. She straightened, placing her hand over her chest, not in pledge, but in remembrance. She was still queen, not of Rome's design, not of Caesar's imagining, but of herself, and the river knew her name. The room was quiet in a way that felt absolute. Not the quiet of an empty space, but the deeper kind. The silence that comes when time itself slows and every object, every breath, every flickering flame understands what is about to occur. The walls were veiled in linen dyed in shades of the Nile at dusk, blue fading into violet, streaked faintly with the golden glow of oil lamps placed in each corner of the chamber. Their flames danced gently, steady and patient, as if reluctant to disturb what they lit. In the center of the room stood a low ceremonial table carved from cedar, polished until it shone like still water. On it sat the basket, woven from river reeds, carefully arranged with palm leaves and soft flaxen cloth. It appeared almost ordinary, until you looked inside. There, coiled in perfect stillness, rested the asp. Its body moved only with the slow rhythm of its breath, its head resting gently on its own coils, its black eyes glinting like obsidian in the low light. There was no fear in the creature, no anticipation. It simply was. It waited, as it had been trained to do, for the hand that would make the final gesture. Cleopatra entered without escort, her steps slow and soundless, her robe flowing around her like water drawn by the moon. She crossed the threshold with the composure of one who was not walking toward death, but toward completion. Her hair had been bound in a braid that shimmered faintly with gold, and her skin bore the scent of fig oil and crushed lotus. She looked neither proud nor sorrowful, only resolved. The asp did not move as she approached. It did not strike, did not coil, did not retreat. It merely observed, perhaps sensing the calm that emanated from her, the stillness of a queen who had ruled not only a kingdom, but herself. She stood for a long moment before the table, hands folded over her abdomen, eyes fixed on the creature that would carry her across the threshold between worlds. There was no trembling in her hands, no faltering of breath. Her thoughts drifted, not to Rome, not to the throne, not even to her lovers. They wandered instead to a memory of the Nile in flood season, when the water rose and made the fields into lakes, and she had ridden through them in a boat carved from cedar, laughing as reeds brushed against her fingers. She thought of the laughter of her children in the palace garden, the sound of sandals on sun-warmed stone, the smell of ink on scrolls she had once read under lamplight. There had been so much life, and now there would be silence. She lowered herself to her knees beside the table, the robe pooling around her like a second skin. With one hand, she reached forward, slow and deliberate, and drew the cloth gently aside. The asp lifted its head slightly, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement, as if it, too, had been waiting for this moment with understanding. Cleopatra's other hand rested lightly on her thigh. Her breathing was steady. She spoke no words. There were no final proclamations, no cries, no farewells. Only the soft sound of silk against skin and the whisper of one breath flowing into the next. And then, with infinite grace, she guided the asp toward her skin. The bite came swift and quiet, not violent, not theatrical. A single motion, barely felt at first, like the prick of a thorn, like the kiss of the gods. The asp withdrew without ceremony and curled once more into stillness. Cleopatra remained seated, her posture serene, her face unchanged. The warmth of the venom began to spread slowly through her veins, not as pain, but as release. Her limbs grew heavy, her eyelids softer. The chamber around her began to blur, not into darkness, but into a soft, golden light. It felt like sinking into water, like drifting into the arms of something vast and kind. She thought again of the stars, of the gods who ruled beyond them, of Isis, who had walked with her through every joy and loss. And then she closed her eyes, not in fear, but in fulfillment. No crown fell, no curtain closed. Only silence remained, deep and perfect, like the still surface of the Nile beneath the stars. The chamber remained still. No one moved. No wind stirred. Even the lamps seemed frozen in time, their flames perfectly upright, as if the room itself held its breath in reverence. Cleopatra sat where she had knelt, her body resting gently against the velvet cushions laid at the base of the cedar table. Her robe fell around her in soft waves of violet and gold, untouched by tension, as though draped by a careful hand after sleep had come. Her head tilted slightly to the side, her features serene, eyes closed not in pain or resistance, but in deep, sacred rest. There was no blood, no cry, no collapse, only stillness. Her breath, which had slowed with each passing moment, had now ceased entirely. Not abruptly, not with alarm, but gradually, like the final note of a distant harp, fading into silence so softly it left no echo. Her fingers, once adorned with rings that shone like morning suns, now curled loosely in her lap, their purpose fulfilled. Her skin, warmed by oils and moonlight, bore no sign of struggle, only grace. For a time, nothing happened. The asp lay curled in its basket, motionless once more, as if returning to its original state. Guardian, symbol, witness. Its task had been completed, and it, too, honored the silence. In the corridor outside the chamber, her handmaidens waited. They had not been told what to expect, but they knew. They always knew. These were women who had walked with the queen through war and birth, through betrayal and beauty. They understood the rhythm of her life, and now they felt its end. Like the absence of music in a room where it had always been playing. At last they entered, slowly, carefully. Their footsteps barely made a sound upon the mosaic floor. They wore white robes, unadorned. Their hair was braided with linen ribbons, simple and ceremonial. Each one moved with quiet reverence, eyes lowered until they reached the edge of the chamber. And then they saw her. No one spoke. There were no gasps, no tears, only the sound of breath catching in the throat, not from fear, but from awe. For in that moment, Cleopatra did not look dead. She looked eternal. They moved around her with precision and care. One placed a small lotus blossom on her chest, just above her heart. Another removed the serpent gently from the room, speaking softly to it as if it were a guest now leaving. A third drew the linen veil across the entranceway, shielding the room from the outside world. This was no longer a place of the living. It was a tomb, a shrine, a legend sealed in stillness. Outside, Alexandria lay quiet beneath the weight of night. The streets were empty, the stars unchanged. Far across the sea, Rome stirred in anticipation, unaware that what it hoped to conquer had already passed beyond its reach. The Queen of Egypt had chosen her ending, and in doing so, she had claimed something greater than survival. She had claimed peace, and in that peace, she slept. Not as a victim, not as a relic, but as a ruler whose legacy had already begun to drift through time like incense in temple air. Cleopatra, last daughter of the Nile, now belonged to the ages. The dawn had not yet arrived, but the sky above Alexandria had begun its slow transition. The deep black of night faded gently to blue, that fragile in-between hue that only exists for a breath of time. When the stars are still watching, but the sun has begun to stir behind the horizon. In the palace, no trumpet sounded, no bell rang. The world outside had not yet heard. But within those ancient walls, the loss was already known, felt not in the air, but in the hearts of those who had served her. In the quiet of a corridor just beyond the death chamber, her attendants gathered. No one had summoned them. They came because something in their bones told them to. These were women who had bathed her, dressed her, carried her letters, prepared her oils. Some had served her since girlhood. Others had joined only recently. But now they stood as one, bound not by rank or duty, but by devotion. No one spoke for a long time. The silence between them was deep, sacred. When at last the eldest among them stepped forward, her hands trembled slightly as she drew aside the linen veil covering the doorway. She entered alone. Inside, the lamps still burned, though their flames had grown tired, curling low in their bowls. The scent of sandalwood and death lingered, not heavy, but present, faint, like the ghost of a memory. She approached Cleopatra's still form and knelt beside her. Her breath caught. The queen looked untouched by pain. Her face was calm, lips parted ever so slightly as though she were about to speak. The robe she wore shimmered faintly in the lamplight, the gold thread catching fire with every flicker of movement. Her fingers still rested on her lap, graceful even in stillness. The attendant bowed her head and wept. Not loudly, but with quiet sobs that shook her shoulders and dampened the marble floor. She whispered a name. Not a title, not a prayer. Just a name. One spoken in kitchens, in corridors, behind closed doors. One that only those who truly knew her used. And then, slowly, others joined. One by one, they came. They removed their sandals, washed their hands, stepped lightly into the room as if entering a sacred garden. Some knelt, some stood in silence, some placed offerings at her feet, a comb, a folded piece of linen, a tiny carved cat made of ivory. These were not grand gestures. These were tokens of love, of a shared life, of days spent waiting, preparing, serving. Not out of fear, but from fierce, unwavering loyalty. They did not wail. Cleopatra would not have wanted that. They did not tear their robes or cry out to the heavens. Their mourning was softer, deeper. It was the mourning of women who had seen her in both strength and weakness, in majesty and exhaustion, and who had remained, not because they had to, but because they chose to. In one corner of the room, a young girl barely 15 years old sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had only served the queen for a few months. She had thought there would be more time, more to learn, more to understand. Now she simply watched as the others moved with grace and grief, learning that this too was part of service. Eventually, the room grew full, not of people, but of feeling. The weight of history, the echo of decisions, the stillness of something sacred. And when it became too much, the handmaidens began to hum. It was an old melody, one sung during rites of passage, when a soul was believed to be crossing the threshold into the stars. It had no words. It didn't need them. The sound alone was enough. It wrapped around Cleopatra like a final robe, warm and invisible, sewn not of silk, but of memory. It rose and fell with breath, with sorrow, with reverence. And when it faded, it left behind a silence that would carry her name into the next morning, and into legend. The sky over Alexandria had shifted. The dawn, once soft and golden, now pressed heavily on the palace walls, dimmed by the strange quiet that settled over the city. There were no cries in the streets, no celebration among the soldiers. The victory, though total, felt unfinished. The people had not risen against their queen. They had simply waited, watched from behind shuttered doors as Rome's banners crept across their skyline like ivy strangling stone. At the palace gates, the great bronze doors opened without ceremony. They swung inward with the slow resistance of age, the groan of their hinges echoing into the courtyard like the sigh of an ancient guardian conceding the inevitable. Behind them stood Gaius Octavian, nephew of Caesar, architect of empire, soon to be named Augustus. His posture was rigid, his armor immaculate, the crimson of his cape catching the rising sun. But his face betrayed nothing, not triumph, not rage, only a controlled, unreadable calm. He did not speak as he stepped into the courtyard, his boots clicking softly on the worn marble tiles. Behind him followed a small group of Roman officials, officers, scribes, commanders, all quiet, all watching. They had expected more. Resistance, panic, perhaps even the spectacle of conquest. But what greeted them was silence. The gardens were untouched. The fountains still ran. The corridors stood empty but orderly, as if the palace had prepared itself for death as carefully as its queen had. Servants lined the inner halls, heads bowed, robes pale. They said nothing, offered no protest, no tears, no welcome. They simply stood like statues, like tomb guardians, marking Octavian's passage through the world their queen had built. The further he walked, the heavier the silence became. This was not the silence of defeat. It was reverent, intentional, and it followed him like a veil of smoke. He passed under painted ceilings where gods once danced across the stars, past mosaics of lotus blossoms and rising suns, past doorways carved with prayers older than Rome. Every surface whispered memory. Every corner reminded him that this was not a palace Rome had built. It was one it would never truly understand. When he reached the entrance to the queen's final chamber, he paused. The door was open, but he did not immediately enter. He glanced toward one of his officers, a young man, barely out of youth, who had never seen the queen in life. The officer waited for command. Octavian gave none. Instead, he stepped forward alone. The room was dim. Lamps burned low, their flames curling like breath. The scent of frankincense and rose oil clung to the air, sweet and soft and unmistakably funereal. The curtains had been drawn back to let the morning in, but the light stopped short of the center of the room, as if even the sun dared not disturb what it saw. There she sat, Cleopatra, still upright, still crowned. Her posture perfect, her expression serene, her body wrapped in silk and gold that shimmered like morning water. She had died not in agony, but in stillness, not with force, but with grace. It was as though she had stepped just beyond reach into another world, and left behind not a corpse, but an icon. Octavian stood there for a long time. He had imagined this moment. For months, perhaps years. He had envisioned her in chains, standing in the Forum of Rome, her eyes hollow, her pride broken. He had spoken often of her fall, of how he would display her as a trophy of conquest, a symbol of Rome's dominion over the East. But now, seeing her here, untouched by his armies, claimed only by her own will, the image shattered. This was not a woman conquered. This was a woman transformed. He approached slowly, his footsteps barely audible on the stone. He stopped just short of her reach. The asp was gone, removed by careful hands, but its work remained, traced in the faintest mark at her breast. He looked into her face, expecting to feel satisfaction. But what he felt was something closer to discomfort, perhaps even unease. He had won, yes, but she had chosen how the world would remember her, and she had done so before he arrived. Her death had robbed him of the spectacle, but not of the lesson. Beside her lay a small offering bowl. Inside it, a strip of parchment bearing hieroglyphs he could not read, and a simple gold ring, the shape of a falcon in flight. His officers would later catalog the artifacts, estimate their value, write reports for Rome. But Octavian did not touch them. Not then. He simply looked, studied, witnessed. Behind him, one of the commanders stepped forward, clearing his throat softly. "Shall we prepare her body for transport, Imperator?" he asked. Octavian did not answer right away. His gaze lingered on Cleopatra's face, on the woman who had outwitted emperors, seduced gods, raised armies, and ruled through storms. On the woman who had denied him the spectacle but left behind the myth. "No," he said at last, his voice low, calm. "She will be buried here, as a queen." And with those words he turned. His cape swept behind him like the shadow of an eagle. His footsteps echoed down the hall. He did not look back. The war was over, but the story had only just begun. The city of Alexandria awoke not to trumpet calls or proclamations of triumph, but to a stillness that felt almost sacred. The sea, ever restless, had softened overnight. The gulls flew lower, quieter. The winds that usually danced through the market stalls and between the marble columns of the agora had slowed to a thoughtful hush. It was as though the city itself understood what had passed within its walls. Something ancient had ended. Something unspoken had settled. In the palace, the corridors were swept, the lamps relit. Priests in white linen moved silently through the inner courtyards, chanting soft prayers in the old tongue. Prayers meant not for celebration, but for safe passage. They burned incense in the shadow of statues older than any emperor and whispered the names of the gods into the dawn. The air smelled of myrrh and dust, of memory and loss. Cleopatra's body was prepared according to rites older than Rome. Her servants, who had once dressed her in silks and combed her hair with golden pins, now wrapped her in linen with steady hands. They placed amulets over her heart, her tongue, her brow. They painted symbols onto her skin, not to preserve power, but to ensure peace, to guide her safely into the next life, where kings and queens walked among the stars. Beside her, in another chamber, lay Mark Antony. His wounds were bound, his face washed, his arms crossed upon his chest. They would be buried together, not as lovers, not as myth, but as two souls who had defied the world in their own time and on their own terms. Their tomb, carved into the sacred earth beyond the palace walls, would be sealed with stone and silence. No public display, no Roman pageantry, just the quiet end of a royal line. The funeral was small. No crowds were invited. No speeches were given. Only those who had known her truly were permitted to bear witness. The sky remained pale as they lowered her into the earth, soft light illuminating the curve of her profile one last time, her lips faintly parted as though still speaking dreams. A priest offered a final invocation. Then, without fanfare, the chamber was closed, and with it, the final breath of a kingdom older than empire. Outside, the city returned to motion. The markets reopened. Ships creaked in the harbor. Rome's banners were raised above the citadel, fluttering in the morning breeze. Orders were issued, new taxes set, officials appointed. The machinery of empire turned without pause. But something beneath it had shifted. The Ptolemaic line was gone. The blood of Alexander, of pharaohs, of queens who traced their power to gods and stars, had vanished from the throne. Egypt would now be ruled from afar, its temples studied, its gold taken, its stories rewritten by men who did not speak its language. But Cleopatra had not vanished. Not truly. She lived in the whispers passed between mothers and daughters, in the lines of poetry scrawled in the margins of scrolls, in the jewelry shaped like cobras, the paintings of women with proud eyes and upright spines. She lived in myth. Yes, but myth is only another form of memory, carved deeper than history can ever reach. And though Octavian would be named Augustus, and Rome would stretch its hand across the known world, there would always remain a part of that world that whispered her name in secret. Cleopatra, last queen of the Nile, daughter of the sun, mirror of the goddess, who met death not in chains, but in gold. And the Nile, which had seen everything, wars, dynasties, lovers, gods, flowed on, unchanged, unbothered, endlessly remembering. And now, dear listener, the story has come to its end. The stars still shine above the Nile. The river still flows, quietly carrying the memory of queens, kings, and forgotten empires. But you are here, safe and still, resting at the edge of a story far older than words. Cleopatra's last night was not just an ending. It was a final act of strength, of silence, of beauty. A choice to meet history not with fear, but with dignity. And perhaps in that, there is something for all of us to carry into our own lives, into our dreams, into the quiet hours of the night. As you drift deeper now, let the stillness of the past wrap gently around you. Let the soft rhythm of the Nile, the flicker of torchlight, the whisper of silk carry you into rest. The world is quiet now. The story has been told. And you can simply let go. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let sleep take you. You are safe, you are home. Good night.